There are plenty of lenses out there, but there's one I keep coming back to, again and again. Today we're talking about the Sony 35mm f2.8 Zeiss Sonnar T-Star, a lens that's been in my kit for years and has consistently delivered. It's not the fastest, nor is it the most optically perfect, but it's a lens that just works. Every time, at least for me. Let's dive in. For those new here, my name's Henry. By day, I crunch numbers on spreadsheets, and outside of office hours, I'm a street and lifestyle photographer and a camera enthusiast. Today, we're talking about this lens. This lens possibly is the most convenient and light setup when paired with any Sony Alpha camera body for street and travel. The versatility, the compactness, and the ease of use makes it a perfect everyday carry piece of gear. Despite the f2.8 aperture, which isn't the fastest, I find myself returning to this combo because it reduces friction. It eliminates the resistance of carrying heavy gear and simply lets you focus on the task at hand, capturing fleeting moments on the street. A camera setup that inspires you to shoot is more valuable than shooting with a lens or camera with quote-unquote perfect specs on paper. And this setup inspires me every time. These are the reasons why. Firstly, the history of this lens and my personal experience. This was released alongside Sony's mirrorless E-mount system, marking the beginning of Sony's full-frame mirrorless journey. This was released alongside the 55mm f1.8, also a Zeiss badge lens, and their kit 28-70 variable aperture lens. For me personally, it was one of the very first Sony lenses I used, and it's been with me through countless conditions. I've shot in rain and snow, and have even had few accidental drops, and yet it keeps performing. Some of my earliest favourite images were taken with this lens, and that nostalgic connection makes it a little bit even more special. Number 2, the magic of the 35mm focal length. I wanted to touch briefly on why this lens has grown on me so much over the years, and that's to do with the 35mm focal length. When I first started shooting, I had absolutely zero clue what millimeters meant in photography, and I tried this lens on a whim. And since the beginning, I never found this lens to be hard to use, and now I think back, I think I know why. The 35mm focal length is slightly wider than the natural human field of view, making it incredibly intuitive to compose shots. Since I started my photography journey with this 35mm, over time, it's sort of become second nature. While 50mm is often considered the standard prime, it feels just a little bit too tight for me sometimes. 35mm strikes a better balance in my opinion. It works for portraits, especially environmental and contextual portraits. It works for landscapes, even casual video work. It's truly a versatile focal length. Third, the lens performance. Let's talk briefly about image quality and lens performance. If you're after 100, 200, 400% crop and zooms, pixel peeping, this video is not for you. There's plenty of blogs and YouTube videos for that. I wanted to focus more on my personal experience and the image output that I've gotten over the last few years with this lens. Starting with autofocus. On newer Sony bodies like the Sony a7 IV, the autofocus is quick and reliable, making it great for fast-moving street scenes. Sony's autofocus algorithm is second to none. Subject tracking is reliable, zone focusing is reliable, nothing really beats the Sony in this department. In terms of image quality, it's sharp in the center, with a little bit of softness in the corners. Wide open at f2.8, performance is still solid. It's capable of producing some bokeh, but let's be honest, you're not getting this lens for creamy bokeh. For that, you look for something like the Sigma or Sony G Master f1.4. The lens itself does not have any bells or whistles. There's no AF/MF click switch, there's no aperture ring, there's no custom buttons. Camera gear fanatics have long raved about that Zeiss pop, a rendering quality that's subjective but apparently noticeable. I don't necessarily see a lot of Zeiss pop per se, but perhaps that's because of the slow aperture of f2.8, so there's not much bokeh. But if the Zeiss pop also relates to micro contrast, overall sharpness, this is something that this lens does pretty well in. And the build, full metal construction. It's withstood years and years of abuse, proving its durability. Fourth, size and weight. One of the biggest advantages of this lens, as you've probably gotten the hint by now, it's the size and weight. It balances beautifully on any Sony body. Pair it with something compact, like any of the A7C bodies, or even the APS-C bodies like the A6700, and suddenly you have an ultra portable setup that competes with Fuji's APS-C system in terms of convenience. On paper, when the Sony Zeiss lens is paired with an A7C II, the total weight is 635 grams, versus let's say the Fuji X100 or 6 of 521 grams. So roughly 100 gram trade-off for a full frame setup. You can't sleep on this setup, honestly. The lightweight design combined with a third-party square hood makes it a true grab-and-go setup that reduces friction to shooting, because the look and the feel inspires at least me to make good use of my gear. At the end of the day, that's the most important factor in camera gear. Does it inspire you to shoot? This setup absolutely does it for me. Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect lens. Let's talk about the drawbacks of this lens. The f2.8 aperture isn't ideal for low light. Depending on what you shoot, this may or may not be a deal breaker. At night, you will need to compensate with a high ISO, generally speaking. So if you can't tolerate having any noise in your images for night shooting, this lens is a no-go. There's some color fringing and flaring, though mostly well controlled in my experience. It's not fully weather sealed. Like I've said, I've shot with this in rain and snow, but it's not advisable, especially since there's no rubber ring on the mount. And it's more expensive than the competitors. Since the release, other third-party brands have started producing similar lenses, but at a fraction of the cost. You've got the Samyang 35mm f2.8 and Tamron 35mm f2.8, for example. I don't have personal experience, but from reading reviews, the Sony Zeiss lens appears to not be as sharp or as fast, obviously, as the Sony 40mm f2.5, so it loses to similar newer Sony offerings on that front as well. But despite all that, it goes back to my earlier point. This lens inspires at least me to bring my camera gear everywhere. A true full-frame EDC setup, and that to me is worth more than any spec sheet comparison. The Sony 35mm Zeiss Sonnar T-Star isn't the most hyped about lens. It's not the newest. In fact, it's one of the original classics of the Sony E-mount lineup. This lens is light, compact, and perfect for everyday carry. Keeps me shooting. I'm excited to see lens manufacturers shifting focus to lightweight autofocus compact primes. You've got the Sony 40mm f2.5 and Nikon's 40mm f2, the Fuji Pancake 27mm, Sigma's contemporary line of f2s, and the list goes on. So if you're looking for a lens that balances convenience, quality, and inspiration, the classic Sony Zeiss 35mm just might be the one for you. If you've used this lens, I'd love to hear your experience. Please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this gear review as much as I did making it, please do let me know. I'll be sure to make more. See you in the next one.